Thank you for joining us for the North Texas Coerced Debt Pilot Attorney Training Program. I'm going to cover trauma-informed training at this point. My name is Brittany Hightower. I'm a supervising attorney over program-wide units at Lone Star Legal Aid. I supervise a team that serves survivors of sexual violence. We cover a variety of legal needs, a lot of divorce protection or protective orders, custody, evictions, Title IX complaints, as well as debt collection. Prior to that, I was a senior staff attorney at Lone Star Legal Aid, and I've also been an assistant attorney general for the Office of the Attorney General of Texas, an assistant county attorney for the Williamson County Attorney's Office, and a senior staff attorney for Texas Advocacy Project. So our goal today is learn how to define trauma and how it impacts us as humans, understand how trauma affects our work as lawyers, learn how to be a trauma-informed lawyer, and then also identify signs of vicarious trauma and how to respond. So just a quick caveat about pronouns. We know very well that people of any and all genders and sexual orientations can be abusers, and that they can also be people who've been abused. I make a conscious effort to try to avoid gender presumptions when I present. That said, sometimes I'm going to slip up because the vast majority of my clients have been women and girls who were abused by men. I just ask for a little bit of grace when that inevitably happens, and just recognize that I'm absolutely not trying to ignore or minimize the experience of cis male or queer survivors. So what is trauma? So trauma is a psychological and physiological response to a terrible event. There's a couple different kinds of trauma. Acute trauma results from a single distressing event. So think like a car accident, a natural disaster. Chronic trauma results from prolonged exposure to a particularly distressing event. So if you think of people who've experienced war. Developmental trauma results from exposure to adverse experiences during a critical period of a person's development in childhood. So think like childhood neglect. Historical trauma is cumulative emotional and psychological trauma that can exist across generations. So think of forced relocation, slavery, genocide. Vicarious trauma is the emotional residue or the emotional trauma that one can develop from being exposed to somebody who's already gone through trauma. So think like a therapist, healthcare workers, first responders, things of that nature. And then lastly, complex trauma occurs when an individual experiences multiple traumatic events. So for example, somebody who experienced childhood abuse and neglect and then went on to survive a natural disaster and maybe a car accident when they got older. So in order to understand what a trauma response looks like, we first have to understand what a, quote, normal functioning brain looks like. So typically our brain is going to record experiences in a way that allows us to recall information clearly and chronologically. But during a traumatic event, the brain often goes into what people commonly think of as fight or flight mode, where you have increased activity in the part of the brain that's associated with emotional processing, and then reduced activity in the part of the brain that's associated with logical and chronological sequencing. So this, in addition to the stress hormones that are often released during traumatic events, can interfere with our natural process of forming memories and can create gaps or fragmentation in the person's ability to recall that information later on. So let's talk about what different trauma responses look like. These are instinctual reactions that humans and animals have developed as a survival mechanism in response to perceived threats. It's your body's attempt to keep you alive. These automatic responses will often override any logical or rational thinking abilities. When we're confronted with dangers, our bodies may engage in any of these responses, whether we want to or not. There's no ability to say, I want to fight, I want to flee at this point. It's really important to understand these reactions and that they are often involuntary so we can avoid misinterpreting them. So first, what we mostly think of is fight. Body's preparing itself to confront or combat a threat. So there'll be a rush of adrenaline, increased heart rate. It sometimes in a survivor, this can look like attempts to physically defend oneself, shouting, arguing, active resistance. Similar to fight, flight results in a surge of adrenaline. The body is prioritizing functions that would enable a person to escape the threat. So it's releasing energy stores to the muscles, increased heart rate. The goal is to put distance between oneself and the danger. Freeze is one that we now know a little bit more about, but historically we haven't really thought of as a response. People have always been kind of dismissive of it, but if you've ever heard the phrase deer in headlights, you know that it is a pretty common trauma response. That's an instinctual reaction to kind of temporarily pause or freeze a person, and it allows them to kind of assess the situation and determine what is going to be the safest response, whether it's fleeing, staying there, trying to fight back, things of that nature. And then lastly, one of the more new ones that we are learning about is called fawn. It's the use of people pleasing to diffuse conflict and earn the approval of others. The goal is to basically appease whatever the threat is, so that way it's no longer going to be a danger to you. So trauma, the same type of trauma will affect different people differently. Trauma affects and is influenced by the whole person. So one person's experience of a traumatic event is going to be different based on all these characteristics: their faith and spirituality, their physical health, the quality and strength of their relationships, their existing financial well-being, language, gender, sexuality, all sorts of things. So for example, I had a client who grew up in a very religious community in another country, and as a result of her sexual assault, she was so afraid to return to her community because she wasn't going to be welcomed there. Whereas I have another client who also experienced a sexual assault but grew up in a very different culture, and she was immediately supported by her family and friends, and she's just experienced that sexual assault in a very, very different way, largely because of all of these factors. So trauma is also compounded by having experienced past trauma. Repeated exposure to traumas can result in a complex trauma, and that can lessen a person's ability to thoroughly process one traumatic event before they have to deal with another. So then it creates this compounding trauma. Recent research into adverse childhood experiences had found that certain adverse or negative experiences in childhood directly correlates with higher risk for additional trauma, as well as worse health outcomes as an adult. So it's really important to remember that a survivor of domestic violence often will have experienced all sorts of other traumas in their life prior to that abuse. You will likely not know, and the survivor themselves may not realize that these prior traumas can still have an impact on their daily lives. This is a wonderful video. It's just a very short 2-minute video that I think is worth watching to kind of give you some information about what's going on in the brain. So for example, you can see 2 different trauma responses based on what's happening in the brain. One is going to be an increased emotional response and a decreased logical thinking response. For example, I got stuck in a tornado a couple weeks ago, and because I have past trauma from a tornado, my otherwise logical, rational, calm, prepared self was crying and screaming in the floor of a hotel lobby. That was my emotional response overriding my logical thinking response. But in the alternative, you can also see a survivor, somebody who's been through a traumatic experience, have the reverse, where their emotional response is subdued and they have kind of a flat affect, and they're being overly logical and rational while talking about some really horrible things. Just important to know that there's a neurological basis for both of those trauma responses. So what can trigger trauma response? There's a lot of drama around that particular word trigger, but really what we mean is it's literally triggering a an automatic or a uncontrollable response in the brain. And people can be triggered by a wide variety of stimuli, and that some of them can seem kind of innocuous for different people if they haven't experienced trauma, or again, if they're not that particular person. So think of sensory experiences, and you can think of this even in a positive way, how certain songs or noises or specific smells can bring back positive memories. It can also bring back traumatic memories as well. So a good example of this is thinking of the smell or sound of fireworks and how that often impacts veterans or combat veterans. Significant dates can be a big trigger as well. And it's not necessarily the date that this particular incident happened. It can be other ones. For example, think of the first big holiday after losing a loved one. One of my close friends recently lost her father, and she said that her first birthday after his death was a lot harder than the anniversary of his death. Media, seeing scenes in movies, TV shows, or books that depict abuse or trauma, news stories that discuss similar abuse or trauma can bring back that feeling too. Situational dynamics, this is one that a lot of people don't think of. So for example, certain words or phrases, rather than it being a sensory trigger, it's the context in which it's given. basically just think about that relational dynamic. This can especially be really important in court where a judge having all the authority, sometimes judges kind of yell. That dynamic. It's not so much the sensory experience of it, but it's the situational dynamic about it. Likewise, physical environment, being in enclosed spaces, the inability to escape a particular car driving by, that can all be really traumatic for a client. For example, think of, I practice in Bell County, and so, we serve a lot of veterans. It's not uncommon for veterans to feel really uncomfortable or not feel like they can sit with their back to the exit. And that can be a trauma that comes from the physical environment. And lastly, high stress situations, even if it's completely unrelated to the trauma, can sometimes trigger a trauma response. So what is this going to look like? You'll see it in a couple of ways. You can see emotional responses like fear and anxiety, an actual physical response by sweating, increased heart rate. I've had clients even get to the point where they're vomiting in a trash can. It can look like reliving the traumatic event, replaying it in their mind, having nightmares, flashbacks. It can display in a hyperactive nervous system where they constantly feel like they're on guard, they're easily startled, they have a hard time sleeping. You'll see avoidance behaviors where they will avoid certain places or people that may remind them of the event, avoid case deadlines or anything that can cause stress. In extreme cases, you can see disassociation where people are feeling detached from themselves or feeling like the world isn't real. And also very common, you will see a shift in perception, seeing the world as more dangerous, seeing people as untrustworthy, blaming themselves, a very critical self-assessment of if I'd only done this, this wouldn't have happened to me. Or if I hadn't been so stupid and seen this ahead of time, this wouldn't happen to me. When in reality, that's not the case. So let's talk about how trauma can affect clients, specifically within the legal process. So going back to what some of those triggers can be, specific things we want to think about when we're assisting clients going through the court process. So sensory experiences, again, big ones are going to be voices and yelling. I have a lot of clients, one judge in particular is a big yeller, and I had a client that said, I don't care. I would rather deal with my abuser than go back in there because I can't handle being yelled at like that. If the abuser is going to have to be in court, if that person's going to get notice and may be there, note that just seeing that person or hearing that person's voice can be a trauma trigger. Again, be mindful of significant dates if you possibly can. It is a lot to try to keep track of, and sometimes the client may not even share. I build really close relationships with my clients and they share a lot with me. But even then, sometimes they're not going to tell me that, we've scheduled a court date on their wedding anniversary and I haven't put two and two together. But if you can, be mindful of that. Media. So reviewing evidence is going to be super traumatizing for them. I had one client who he'd been pretty stoic and, kept it together throughout the whole case. But when I was giving my opening statement and spelling out this very complicated fact pattern to the judge, she just broke down crying. And she said just hearing it spelled out all at once was really overwhelming for her. Situational dynamics. Power dynamics in the courtroom is going to be a big one. Even power dynamics with you is going to be a big one. You want to be really mindful of how they're responding to that. They may be interpreting your neutral stance as skepticism. They may fear retaliation from the abuser. They may feel offended or defensive about questions about their personal history, intimate details, things of that nature. The courtroom itself is intimidating. So think about the physical environment. And likewise, stress. The legal process going to court is really stressful. Like I said, sometimes I still get nervous, and I've been doing this for over a decade. So you just want to be mindful and kind of keep checking in with your client on that. Just real quickly, something to kind of keep in mind and recognize what your client may be going through. So if your survivor or the survivor client that you're working with has filed a police report, or if somebody else called the police, this is the whole process that they are dealing with the criminal justice system as a part of addressing the abuse. If the children were involved, if the children were present during the assault that took place, somebody's going to call CPS. Law enforcement's going to call CPS. They're going to get involved at some point. Hopefully it's going to be a quick and easy process where they just interview client, they interview the kids, recognize that client's being protective, and that's the end of it. But that may not be the end of it. She may be required to attend classes, go to counseling, all sorts of things. So in addition to that, CPS may require, or she may want to go through the whole process of getting a protective order to keep herself safe. And that's a whole separate court process. At the same time, there may be a situation where either she needs to file for divorce or the abuser is filing for divorce or custody. So in addition to dealing with CPS and the criminal case and the protective order process, this is a whole other legal case that she has to deal with. And then lastly, housing may not be stable. She may be evicted. I had a client in this exact situation recently where she was living in a house that's owned by the abuser's mother. And as soon as she reported the abuse, she immediately was evicted, and then has to try to find shelter for the kids. So imagine that she's dealing with all of these different processes at the same time, and then is also trying to go through this process with you. And they may not all be happening at the same time, but just remember this isn't the only thing that the survivor has going on. And so just keep that in mind and be sensitive when they may not make deadlines or they may not have accomplished all the tasks that you asked them to accomplish in time. So let's talk about what trauma is going to look like in clients. Just something that you can kind of keep an eye out for. And again, like I said, they can show up in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So emotional responses, we may see intense emotional reactions. There may be crying, tearfulness, sadness, things like that when they're discussing the abuse, but there also may be feelings of hopelessness. They may be expressing suicidal thoughts, catastrophic thinking, or expecting the worst case scenario, wanting to talk to you every single day because they're concerned about something else. They're worried that this is all going to fall apart, increased anxiety around court dates. You may see physical responses. They may be too tired to complete tasks, show up for appointments. You may see them sweating, shaking, or trembling. Again, I've had more than one client who was so overwhelmed that they started vomiting in a trash can right before court. You may see them relive the traumatic event, and that may look like them just repeating the same description of events to you. If you say, okay, I've got this information, you move on to a new question, they may start immediately going back to talking about that. With the hyperactive nervous system, they may have difficulty concentrating or making decisions. They may have key memory gaps. I'm not joking when I tell you, and I tell my clients all the time, that I've definitely had situations where I ask them their names, their birthday, their kids' birthdays, and they just completely draw a blank in court because their brain is just not letting them do it. Again, you may see avoidance behaviors. They may be reluctant to answer phones or return phone calls, reluctant or refuse to share certain details, may get to a point where they want to settle, they want this to go away, they don't want to deal with this anymore because it's really overwhelming and it's bringing back that trauma. You may see some dissociation where you're asking them questions and they forget what they were saying, they blank out, sometimes they don't appear to be there. And again, that shift in perception. They may start blaming themselves for this whole situation, might have some distorted beliefs about you, the judge or the court staff, may question your knowledge or your abilities. Just know that all this is a trauma response. It's not them consciously trying to question you or doubt you. Again, this is going to look different for every different client. So for example, if we have a client that is experiencing nightmares, vomiting during the interview because they're so overwhelmed, they've expressed a fear of the courtroom, you may have somebody who doesn't show up or somebody who doesn't want to show up. And so we want to be mindful about ways that we can address that up front, because part of your job in being a trauma-informed lawyer is seeing it coming down the pike before your client is even able to recognize it. So for these kind of clients, I always encourage them to bring an entire, as big of a support system as they can. If they have a best friend, if they have somebody from church, if they have a coworker, if they have an advocate at the shelter, mom, whoever, anybody that can be a support system, just to know that they have somebody there who cares about them and backing them up can make it so much easier for them to show up in court. For example, if you have a different client that has a very flat affect when you're talking to them, they tend to forget meetings, they're tired all the time, you may have somebody who's not going to present very well as a witness. And so you want to be mindful of that. Try to find whatever corroborating evidence you can bring. But also remember that they're going to be a little bit late to accomplishing tasks. That person may have a much harder time just getting out of bed every day. And then lastly, you may have a combative client who questions if you're a real attorney because you're free, gets angry at your interview questions, insists on doing their own research. These kind of clients can be especially hard to be trauma-informed and empathetic with, but I really encourage you to understand and recognize where that combativeness or that so-called difficult behavior is coming from. It's a trauma response. And if you respond with calm empathy to them, you will often get a really good client relationship from them afterwards. So how do you be a trauma-informed lawyer? There's effectively two parts. It's understanding how trauma affects our clients and making adjustments to our practice in order to make the process less triggering or traumatizing for them and to provide sensitive and effective representation. Second, it's also recognizing that our exposure to our client's trauma is going to affect us and taking steps to prevent the negative effects. So what are the components of trauma-informed learning? How do we do this? So we need to build trust, we need to empower the client, and we need to be transparent with them. So just briefly, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I'm doing this training for judges or prosecutors, I always explain it this way. Basically, if the client doesn't have, or if the witness doesn't have their lower level needs met, you're not gonna see anything at the higher levels. Or more simply put, if that person had to sleep in their car last night or went without dinner because they weren't sure how they were going to feed their kids and themselves, they're going to make a pretty crummy witness. So again, it's really important to be mindful of what somebody's base needs are. So how do you build trust? So again, part of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need to address their basic needs. You want to be easy to talk to and you want to be trustworthy. So again, because of that trauma response, clients cannot trust you unless their basic needs are met, like food, shelter, and safety. Their brain is just going to be so focused on trying to figure that out that they're not really going to be able to connect with you. You're the lawyer. Meeting these needs is not your job, but it is your job to recognize when this isn't happening and make those referrals. Again, everybody you're going to be working with is going to be working with a shelter. So hopefully somebody else is also identifying that. But for various reasons, you may get a client who comes to you and ultimately ends up disclosing to you, I'm sorry, I'm really tired. I had to sleep in my car last night. Or I'm sorry, I'm really foggy. I haven't been able to afford food for the last couple of days and I've just been eating crackers. Stop right there. At that point, recognize you're not going to get anything done productive on this case, and you want to make the referral back to the advocate. You want to refer them to a food bank. Send them back to the people who can help them meet their basic needs. And so then that way that person is ready to come prepare this case with you. Also remember that even if their other basic needs are being met, these trauma responses may also cause the client to feel like other needs aren't being met. So they may feel like they're being attacked. They may feel like they're getting overly tired. You really want to be observant, offer breaks, water, tissues, snacks if you can, other accommodations, because the client may not be able to recognize when they need these. Rather than asking people if I'm doing okay, I try to stop and check in every once in a while. Ask if they would like a break. And even if it looks like they need a break, but they keep saying they're fine, sometimes I put it on myself and say, you know what, I need water. I need to go to the bathroom. Why don't we just take a 5-minute break and just give them some time to themselves? You want to create a safe environment for the client. So this is both physical safety and mental safety. Over the phone, at the every single phone conversation I have with them, I always start by asking, first, is now a good time to talk? Because you never know. The abuser may have stopped by the house. There may be something going on. They may not be in a place where they can talk. And I always ask, how are you? How are you doing right now? I used to ask, are you doing okay? But I stopped because implied in that question is the assumption that they should be okay. If they hesitate, I often tell them it's okay to not be okay right now. It's okay if we want to talk about other things. It's okay if we need to reschedule. It'll be fine. You want to be open about privacy concerns. For a lot of them, they feel like they are paranoid and it's been put into their head by the abuser that they're being paranoid about their security and their privacy. But this is a real fear. And so it's something you want to be mindful. Let them know how you're going to use this information. Let them know why you need this information. Likewise, you want to be easy to talk to. Don't rush them. Let them tell their story as it comes out. Validate their feelings with phrases like, that sounds like it was really hard. Thank you for sharing that with me. That would have been really hard for anyone to go through. Don't push them to get into the really gory details of what happened. They may want to dive into a narrative about a specific event, and then the feelings they had at the time, and then how they feel now. This is a huge sign of trust and vulnerability with you. The client may abruptly stop and say things like, I'm sorry, that wasn't what you asked. I don't know why I started talking about that. I didn't mean to say all that. That's a good thing for them to feel comfortable to let all that out. Reassure them that their feelings and the context they provided are valid, relevant, and absolutely something that you want to hear. Be patient with them. Let them interrupt you. It's very frustrating, especially when you've already heard this same story 12 times and you are 100% confident what they are saying is completely irrelevant to this case. But please wait until they have destroyed your absolute last nerve and then some before asking them to stop talking in order to listen to you. And again, it's really important to remember that for so many of these survivors, a big part of the abuse was telling them to shut up, sit down. Their thoughts were not valid. Their feelings were not valid. They were stupid. Nobody cares about what they have to say. Nobody's going to believe them. And sometimes being interrupted is important. I've definitely had this happen the other day where I was going down this whole path of telling the client what she needed to be doing in order for us to prepare to file this case. And she immediately interrupted me and said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. I already did that 2 years ago. I got the denial letter back from them." And so she just saved us 6 months worth of work by interrupting me. You also build trust through honesty and compassion. Do not make promises. I flat out tell every client I don't make promises, but I'm pretty confident the courthouse is going to be open and we'll be able to finish this case tomorrow. You want to be reliable. I was late to my wedding and I will be late to my own funeral, but I'm never late to court. And then lastly, explain to them why you need this sensitive information and validate that talking about this sensitive information or answering these difficult questions is really, really hard to talk about. And lastly, remember that trust takes time. It's not going to happen all at once. And so just be a little bit patient with it. So important safety considerations. You want to be mindful of their safety considerations in your communication, in their confidentiality and privacy, tech safety, their mental health and emotional well-being, and their physical safety. So for communication, you want to make sure that the means of communication is always safe. Is this a safe phone number? Is it safe to leave voicemails, or will the abuser potentially have access to that? Is it a safe email, or does the abuser potentially have access to that? Do you have a safe physical mailing address? I've had several situations where the survivor is living at a place that was jointly rented. The abuser is prohibited from coming back to that place by a court order, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to stop that person from coming back there and being able to access the mailbox. So maybe we want to use a trusted friend or family member's mailing address. Again, any information that possibly is going to be in the application, you want to make sure you keep as confidential as possible. So I'm always asked them, is it possible that this abuser would go to court and try to access your address through looking up public records? And for a lot of them, they're like, I've never thought about that, but yeah, absolutely. He would totally do that. And so you want to make sure that that information is confidential. Tech safety is huge. I know that this is touched on in another presentation, but I can't emphasize this enough. Look at phones and devices, location tracking, data tracking, geolocation tags on their photos, things that sync with iCloud storage or backup to Google Drive, changing passwords and PINs, even to things that you wouldn't think of. All of this stuff you need to be very, very conscious of. Again, you're the attorney. It's not necessarily your job to go through all this, but you want to be mindful of all this, because if survivors coming and saying, I don't understand how he keeps getting a copy of everything that I send to you. Does he have access to your email? Is all of your stuff, everything that we're sending to you, is it being uploaded to iCloud? Does he still have access to your iCloud? Things of that nature. You want to be mindful of this. Mental health, like we talked about before with the emotional triggers or the trauma triggers, just be mindful of those as well, and make sure that that person's mental safety is taken care of. And then lastly, physical safety. Is the abuser going to be in court? Do we think that the abuser is going to use this notice that we're required to send to them? Are they going to use this as an opportunity to show up and try to intimidate the client in the parking lot? Just ask these questions and go through what their safety concerns are. So how to empower the client? First and foremost, the single most important thing is to remember that the goal of this whole case is for client to feel empowered to make an informed decision. This is the client's case. You provide options and advice, they get to decide. And that decision may look like the worst possible outcome from your perspective, but at the end of the day, it's still their decision. This is their life, and you get to go on about your life when you're done. They have to live with the consequences of these choices. You want to ensure that the client understands the process, explain it to them, clearly identify the steps involved, identify potential triggers throughout the process, and recognize and accept that client may need a lot of repetition and they may change their mind at points. You want to research and provide alternatives. Engage with the client to understand if the litigation route aligns with their desired outcomes. While some may see it as a means to justice, others might find more solace in avoiding the process. I have a client who's an elderly lady. She's in her 80s. She has a mountain of coerced debt. But she is judgment proof. She has no intention of buying a house or a car. She lives with family that provides all of her financial support for her. For her, trying to address that coerced debt was going to be more trauma than it was worth. And so it's important to remember that even though this avenue is here for them, it may not be something that ultimately is going to meet their goals. So lastly, transparency, how to be transparent. Clearly define your role. Make sure the client knows exactly what you're responsible for and what falls outside your purview. This establishes boundaries and sets clear expectation. This is really important part of being trauma informed, because if you're doing it really well, that client is going to come to see you or start to want to see you as a friend, as somebody they can dump all their troubles to. And so reinforcing these boundaries about who you are and what your job is really important. You can redirect them back to the advocate. If they, are expressing a lot of intense feelings to you, talk about, let's engage with therapy. Maybe we want to go see a therapist. Maybe we want to talk to somebody. Do you have a strong support system? Why don't we contact your best friend? Why don't you talk to this person? Because again, you want to be kind and supportive when they're sharing this with you, but it's not your job to be their therapist. You want to clarify what reasonable expectations are for everyone involved, what we're expecting from the judge, what you expect from client, what client should expect from you. You want to explain why those trauma details matter. You also want to break down the law. Legal jargon can be really intimidating, and so using lay terms and relatable analogies can make the law more accessible to the client. And then also present choices, empower them with that agency, lay out potential pathways, solutions, or strategies that they can choose from, ensuring that they feel part of the decision-making process. Is it just that they want the debt collector to stop contacting them? Is it that they want to clean up their credit report? Is it that they want to do everything they possibly can? Give them the choices and options and then let them make that decision. So here's just a couple of important points for interviewing a client. Don't make it about you and don't assume anything. Make sure you want to cover everything with the client. I always ask people what their goals are up front, because if I have somebody coming to me saying, I was assaulted and me and the kids are afraid of him. Well, I don't want to automatically go into that and assuming, okay, you're going to want a protective order, you're going to want a divorce, you're going to want all this. You never want to assume that. That may be the case, but you don't want to assume. You want to find out with them what's important to them. You want to review any and all available information before the first call, so that way you're prepared. Another big part of this is you don't want to ask them just to keep telling their story over and over again. If they already told an intake worker, and then they also told your paralegal, and they also told the advocate these key details, and that's written down somewhere, you don't want to go to them at the beginning and be, blank slate and say, okay, tell me everything that happened. Tell me what's going on. If they've already given that information to somebody, it feels like you haven't even bothered to listen. Why did they tell somebody before if you haven't already looked at it? I went through that. Use plain language, not legalese. Apologize. This is something that attorneys don't like to do very often, but I do it all the time. And it's very humanizing. If I'm running a few minutes late, I say, I'm really sorry for running late. Thank you for your patience. If I misremembered a child's name, I'm so sorry I did that. Thank you for correcting me. If you misgender somebody, you don't have to make a big deal about it, but don't feel like by apologizing, you're giving up something. By apologizing, you're putting yourselves more on an equal playing ground and making them feel like an active participant in the process. And then lastly, don't touch. I know that sounds like kind of a weird thing to say, but it's a very common thing for a lot of people to tap somebody on the shoulder or touch somebody on the arm to kind of point them in the right direction or get their attention. For a lot of survivors, that can be really, really triggering. And I've come to realize that. So I don't ever touch them. Occasionally, if you have a client that wants a hug at the end, like that's fine, but just don't use other ways to get their attention. So when interviewing the client, here's a couple of important phrases that you want to use, and then phrases that you definitely don't want to use. Tell them, recognize that this is uncomfortable. Thank you for telling me that. I'm not here to judge you. Sometimes I tell them, whatever you think that you're going to tell me, how wild you think it is, I promise you I've already heard something crazier this week. I'm sorry that happened to you. And then if you don't know the answer, let them know, I'm not sure, but I'll find out. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to agree to help them find the answers. A couple really important things not to say. Don't say I know. Don't say I understand. Because at the end of the day, you don't understand or know what it's like to be in their exact situation. And even if you think you do, or even if you probably do, most people don't respond really well. They will often feel like, no, you can't know. You have absolutely no idea. what it feels like this. So the term I use in lieu of that is I recognize. I recognize that this is a really difficult situation. I recognize that that was really hard for you. Don't tell them not to say things. Don't tell them that you need to get over it. Don't make any guarantees or promises. A lot of survivors do find a very deep comfort in their faith, and a lot of my clients will specifically say, you know, I feel okay because I know this is part of God's plan. I know God has me, and that's okay for them to say. If your faith is important to you and you agree with them, it's okay to validate that feeling for them, but don't initiate this, because for a lot of survivors that can feel really traumatizing and very minimizing or dismissive of what they went through. And then two other words, don't use the word rape. For whatever reason, that's just a very harsh word. It's a very heavy word for them to hear. If that's the term that they're using to describe something that happened to them, then that's okay, but you don't want to initiate that. I still just use sexual assault. And force. For a lot of survivors, especially with the coerced debt component, it can be really hard for them to wrap their brain around this idea that they were forced to do something. It doesn't feel that way for them, so we don't want to put that word on them unless that's how they're describing it. So preparing for court. It's really important that you review everything that the client needs to know, explain the court environment to them, and then provide emotional support and safety plan. So reviewing what the client needs to know, make sure that they know all the basic facts about the case, review any court filings with them so that way they know what's been filed, because the judge is going to hold them accountable, or it's their pleading. It's something that they filed, even if you're the one that filed. So they need to know what's going on. If you need to use an interpreter, that's something that you need to review ahead of time with the client. Review their testimony. If you're not super experienced in preparing clients for court, this is something that can feel a little counterintuitive or a little tricky to go over with them. But in my experience, most clients feel like they need you to tell them what the right answer is. They need to know what to say. And my explanation to them always is, it's just the truth. I just need you to answer the question truthfully in that moment. Don't guess. I don't know, and I don't remember valid answers. And I always tell my clients, if I ask you what your name is, and that moment, for whatever reason, you're drawing a blank and you don't remember, it's okay to say, I don't remember. That is a valid answer in that moment, as long as it's true. If they didn't hear or understand the question, don't guess. Don't just go fishing around trying to find the answer that you think is going to make the question asker happy. Answer the question that you heard, or if you didn't hear it or you didn't understand it, you can ask them to repeat it or rephrase it. It's also important to remind the client that the judge may interrupt and have their own questions. I don't like it. It's usually traumatizing for clients, or can be a little scary for clients, but it is going to be an inevitable part of the process. Some judges just do it, and it's best for the client to be prepared that that may happen. Talk to client about what is court appropriate, what the exact arrival time is, exactly where you're going to meet them, what the dress code needs to be, what childcare they need to take care of. Some clients don't realize that it's inappropriate not to bring their kids to court. I have some clients where they literally don't have any other option. And so I've had to figure something else out that way. But a lot of times they don't realize that that's not appropriate, and they can't just leave their kids sitting in the benches and waiting for them. And again, with dress code, be mindful about how you describe this. I've had some people say, dress how you would for church, dress how you would for a job interview, things of that nature, but recognize that people from different cultures or different communities may view what you would wear to church or what you would wear to a wedding very differently from what we would think is court appropriate. So use specific terms, no short sleeves, or wear a blazer, or no flip-flops. Be very specific with them about what's appropriate and what's not going to be appropriate. Explain the court environment. Explain where everybody is going to sit, who the court reporter is, who the bailiff is, because if a client is expecting to show up in court and it's just going to be you and a judge, and there's 20 other people sitting there waiting for the docket, they might get overwhelmed and realize, oh, all these other people are going to hear me. So you want them to be prepared for that possibility. Specific locations and directions. Even if clients say, yes, I know where the courthouse is, I still send them the address, because inevitably, probably once a month, once every 2 months, I will have somebody who will just Google X county courthouse and show up at the old historic courthouse and then call me in a panic and say, I don't know where this is. You want to explain where parking is going to be, whether you're going to meet them outside and walk in with them, exactly where you're going to meet them when they walk inside. You will have met your clients beforehand, so this probably isn't going to be a big issue, but a lot of my clients, we've only spoken over the phone before we meet in court. So I give them a very detailed description. short blonde hair. This is what color my glasses are. This is what I'm wearing. I have a brown leather bag, exactly what I look like. So that way it's easy for them to come up and find me. And then lastly, provide the emotional support and safety plan. Again, ensuring that support team, I can't tell you what a huge difference it makes, even just for them to have sister there, to have their best friend there, just to have the advocate, even if they're not super close with their advocate, just to have somebody who is on their side and just know that they're sitting there waiting for them, it makes all the difference in the world. Explain the bailiff and the security staff as well. That's really important to let them know. If we have concerns that the abuser is going to be present, I tell them in advance. When we walk in, I'm going to be there 10 minutes before you. I'm going to go talk to that bailiff. I'm going to tell the bailiff you have a protective order. I may give the bailiff a copy of the protective order. I'm going to describe what the abuser looks like, what our concerns are. I'm going to go over everything in advance so the security staff is ready and prepared. I often, if it's necessary, if the abuser's there, have security staff walk my client out to their car. Sometimes it's easier, just given the layout of the courtroom or the courthouse, to have security staff walk the abuser out and ensure that they've driven off and left the property and they're several blocks away before my client leaves, so they can't follow my client. It just depends on the circumstances. So just talk that through with them if they have safety concerns. And so after court, you want to debrief and explain what happened. Even if client says, oh yeah, no, I understand everything that's going on, still walk through exactly what judge said, what the ruling was, what happened, and what the next steps are going to be. Ask if they have any questions, confusions, concerns, because even if client says that they understand, there's a really good possibility that maybe they missed something important. And so that repetition is key. Even if they heard and understood everything judge said, hearing you repeat it back to them is going to really help them understand and connect with it. Do an emotional check-in. Again, I always ask, how are you doing? Do you need anything? Encourage the client to engage in self-care. This is also something I cover with them in advance too, where if I know it's going to be particularly traumatizing, I always let them know, don't schedule anything afterwards. Because sometimes they feel like, okay, I got this. I'm going to go right back to work afterwards. Or I have to go pick up the kids and take them to a soccer game or something. And I always tell people, be mindful. You're going to feel emotionally drained. You're going to feel exhausted. You may feel sad. So don't schedule anything difficult for yourself afterwards, and then plan something nice. Maybe going to the kids' soccer game is going to be a nice reprieve afterwards, but just make sure that they're conscious of that. And then also refer client to resources and back to the advocate if necessary. If they are having an exceptionally hard time, if they're struggling sleeping again, things like that, again, refer them back to the advocate to help connect them with those resources. And again, like I mentioned before, the safety considerations, just kind of playing with them, exiting the courthouse, any safety considerations, transportations, etc. And again, boundaries and personal comfort. I'm a very connected person with my client. Not everybody is. That doesn't work for every attorney, and that's perfectly fine. Some of them may want to hug. Some of them may just want to shake your hand. Some of them may not want to talk to you ever again and be like, okay, fine. That's fine. But just make sure that you know what boundaries you're comfortable with. And if you're not feeling comfortable with a hug and client wants to hug you, let them know. Just say, I prefer to shake hands, anything like that. You're not doing anything wrong if that's your personal boundary. Really quickly, we're just going to cover vicarious trauma. So what is vicarious trauma? It is the natural consequent behaviors and emotions that often result from knowing about a traumatizing event that somebody else experienced, and the resulting stress from helping or wanting to help that traumatized person. Those symptoms can also mimic that of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the person who experienced the trauma can experience these symptoms. You experiencing vicarious or secondary trauma can also experience those symptoms. So the effects of secondary trauma, they can be positive, neutral, or negative. One thing that we should touch on a little bit more is the positive experience of all this. Working with somebody who's been a trauma survivor can actually produce a lot of really positive responses in you. It has for me specifically. It's something called vicarious resilience. We're watching your client experience this resilience and this empowerment going through that whole process, and starting here, where they are in a shelter and they're not really sure where they're going to go, and then ending the process feeling stronger and empowered. That makes me feel incredible. That makes me feel like I too can also accomplish anything, even if it's much more minor in comparison. And then compassion and satisfaction. You feel like you've done a really good job. You feel like your work means something. There's really wonderful benefits that come to working with trauma survivors. There's neutral effects where you experience that trauma, you feel it, you process it, and you move on. But what we're mostly concerned about is the negative experiences where you experience compassion fatigue, burnout, or you start seeing the same effects as the direct trauma. So here's a couple of negative emotions or negative responses that you may personally see as part of working with trauma survivors. Difficulty managing your emotions, feeling emotionally numb or shut down, avoiding intimacy, worrying excessively about potential dangers to yourself or loved ones. This is a huge one for me that I have to struggle with all the time. Fatigue, sleepiness, or difficulty sleeping, being easily distracted, feeling hopeless about the future, withdrawing from friends and family, avoiding work and interactions with clients or colleagues, increased irritability, aggressive, explosive behavior, destructive coping or addictive behaviors, and lack of decreased participation in activities that used to be really enjoyable for you. So there's a couple things that can make people more vulnerable to having a negative response to vicarious trauma or being exposed to somebody else's trauma. If you've had prior traumatic experiences yourself, if you experience a lot of social isolation, both on and off the job, y'all, the pandemic was really, really rough for all of us doing this work and working from home. So that social connection is really important. If you automatically just kind of have, if you're that person who has a tendency to avoid feelings or sort of withdraw or assign blame to others in stressful situations, if you're someone who just inherently has difficulty expressing your feelings, also your work environment can add to that. If there's a lack of preparation, orientation, or training and supervision in this kind of work, which is why we're doing this training here to make sure that you have all the support that you need and deserve to do this work. If you're a newer employee or less experienced at your particular job, if you're exposed to constant and intense trauma with little or no variation in tasks, which we want to avoid. And then also if you have a lack of an effective or supportive process for discussing the traumatic content of this work, all of those can lead to making you more vulnerable to negative experiences of vicarious trauma. And so here's just a couple of things that you want to keep in mind that will, if you can help you prevent negative experiences and then also heal from secondary trauma if it happens. Preventing and healing is going to look different for everyone. If you're not ready for the inevitable change in your worldview that comes from working with trauma survivors, that's 100% okay. But I do encourage everybody to stretch and push themselves beyond their comfort zone in order to learn and grow and connect with these survivors. But there's absolutely situations where pushing or stretching yourself isn't a good idea. And it's really important to have clear limits and boundaries with the client and colleagues and know what's going to work for you. So just a couple things. I always encourage everybody to take breaks. Whether it's taking a break and taking cases, had a particularly rough case and you're just not ready for another one for a while, that's totally fine. If you're in the middle of working on a case and you, for example, I did an affidavit for a protective order for a human trafficking survivor, and she had been trafficked from the time she was 14 and trafficked by multiple people, including family members. Talking through that with her and writing that affidavit was particularly tough. And so I just ended up taking the rest of the afternoon off. I needed a break, I needed to go for a walk, and I needed to not think about this anymore. Lean on your colleagues and resources. This is incredibly important. Don't feel like there's a stupid question. Don't feel like you should know this because this work is hard enough as it is. So we need to do it together as a team. If your faith or spirituality is really important to you, don't neglect that. Pay attention to that, really connect with that because that can help counteract a lot of the negative effects from secondary trauma. Ensure good nutrition. And I don't mean like making sure you're counting your macros, I just mean eat, honestly. Like sometimes you get so engaged in the work that you don't realize that you've gotten low blood sugar or that you haven't eaten in a while. And that can really affect your mood and that can really affect how you are processing this traumatic information when you receive it. Engage in movement and exercise. You don't have to run a marathon, but just get up and walk around, especially while you're hearing these negative experiences and this traumatic event. Therapy, it's not for everybody, but I've found that it works for a lot of people if that's something that really connects with you. Nurture your outside relationships, spend time outside, find hobbies, anything that's going to bring you joy, that's going to counteract hearing the traumatic events that these clients have gone through. Here's several resources, just a couple links for information on trauma-informed lawyering, some more information about what trauma responses look like. There's a link here to more information about what adverse childhood experiences are and how they impact us as we get older. several links to cover more information about neurobiology of trauma, if that's something that you'd like to learn more about. For mental health, I included the suicide hotline. If you're interested more in doing some safety planning, I've included a couple of really great links to help people understand what safety planning is and how to build safety plans. And then lastly, some really important links about how to address what vicarious trauma is and then how to address it if that's something you're experiencing. Thank you so much for doing this work. And in addition to being a trauma-informed lawyer, please take care of yourself when you're doing this work.